Hello and welcome to this special edition of Burning Earth Radio. This is your host, Gerard Spring, coming to you from the north. So, I have been plunged back into society after a very long break in the Canary Islands, and I have to say it's been a really interesting experience to feel the effects of being plugged back in, so to speak. Yeah, plugged back in. When you are away for a sufficient period of time, I think it takes really about 2 months, but when you're away for a sufficient amount of time, you begin to adjust to your new environment. And when you're in an isolated environment, when you're in nature, it's a very different experience than being plugged into society. And there's a lot of things that you notice in yourself along the way. So when I was walking around in nature, I have to say, felt really in tune with things. I started to get in tune with myself, and I discovered some really deep things about myself. And perhaps I would have never been able to discover these things about myself had I not gone into nature and gone out and sought that experience. But on coming back into society after being in nature, everything starts to feel a little bit irrelevant. It seems as if society is it's as if we are collectively missing the point somehow. And I think that this is a really odd thing. I would say it's almost a culture shock to come back into a city, a large metropolitan area with a lot of traffic. You know, there's companies here, there's large businesses here, international businesses here. And it's very different than being in a place that's so isolated with such a local economy. And the overall mindset of those two civilizations, two versions of civilization, the rather isolated version, small communities, small farms, versus the larger kind of hyper interconnected matrix that most people feel on a day-to-day basis. And we're swimming in this matrix basically all the time. It's constantly going on around us. It's constantly being plugged into this hyperverse through the computer screen, so to speak. Everything seems a lot faster. Everything seems a lot more brutal. And you really get a sense of the amount of just tension there is in the larger kind of globalistic society that we live in. And the aims of the two societies are also somewhat different, although they align in a couple of points. In the case of a smaller society with a smaller economy, people tend to work together a bit more. People also seem a bit warmer. It seems a bit friendly, but they definitely have their cultural things that are really important for the place that kind of hold them together and bond them to society. And coming back into the matrix, so to speak, you get this sense of everyone being really, really plugged in, and there's a kind of common morality or almost religiosity about calculations involving money and the entire way that the monetary system works, the entire way that the banking system works. The banking system is absolutely brutal in the way it operates. It just does not care. It is the most unfeeling thing in the entire universe, it seems. At least it seems that way. And I think it's when we look at the way the banking system operates and the way it's kind of modified how we operate or normally operate in nature or in smaller societies, for example, coming back into that hyperverse is a really interesting experience because the aims of the banking system are so obviously imperialistic, and the imperialism of banks and the imperialism of money and the religion of money is just so much more obvious when you're in a city versus being on a hiking trail. And this goes back to this state of disconnectedness that I talked about a bit in the last show. Is like, you know, when we are in this city experience, when we're in this economy experience, when we're driving cars, when we're looking at cell phones, when we're staring into the computer, when we're dealing with things, trying to figure things out, like this is a very different scope than walking down a hiking trail, for example, where you can really take the time to absorb what's going around you. It's almost in nature, you're a part of it. You are existing with it, and you are kind of changing along with nature. But in society, there's this imperialism of money, and everyone is kind of respecting all of these visible and invisible hierarchies, which just permeate all of society. Society is extremely hierarchical in the way it works. And in order to understand the effects of abrupt climate change on this society and the grip that this monetary society has on the planet, you begin to understand a little bit more about the denialism aspect of it. Because when you're in nature, you can see the direct effects. You can see that, okay, here there's more rains, here there's less rains, there's, it's hotter. But when we're plugged in, so to speak, it somehow doesn't matter. It's like we can kind of separate ourselves from that because we're in houses or we're in cars or we're in workplaces or businesses or whatever. And that is a very, very disconnected state from nature. So it's easy to understand the denialism in a way, the psychology of the denialism of climate change. And what's behind it is this complete disconnectedness with any understanding of how things actually work in the real world. How do plants grow in the real world? How do products get made in the real world? What is going on in nature, both economically and also just physically, the beauty of nature and the biology of nature, the diversity of biology and the resilience of certain species, the cooperations that come about with multiple species, and how they can be localized here and there based on different things. For example, on the island of La Gomera, you have these canariensis trees, these large palm canariensis trees, which are working in harmony with the geology of the land, which is these narrow channels. So they can kind of grow down these narrow channels in the island, and you have all these other species growing up around them, creating this entire biosphere. It's begin to understand the connectedness to nature and what that actually means, and understanding how nature works by going out and seeing nature. And this is what we kind of fail to do, I think, as a society, is like, we have separated ourselves and we have isolated ourselves, not only physically, but also psychologically and intellectually from nature. Everything kind of becomes an enterprise in science, so to speak. Everything is somehow also monetized in the Matrix. Every movement that is happening in society is monetized. And this is a really scary principle, quite frankly, to have that just basic monetization scheme going on behind the woodwork, especially because the monetized scheme is so ardently corrupt in the way it works and concentrating massive amounts of wealth in the hands of a few people, while more or less leaving everyone else with not very much. In a sense, too, the money has in a way been weaponized because it creates a culture of fear. And everyone is afraid of what's going on. We're always kind of afraid of the future and afraid of the whatever draconian sweeps of the monetary system will come at us next. Just to take care of basic needs is very challenging. For example, in many countries, it can be expensive to see a doctor. There can be very long waits to see doctors in places, for example, sometimes upwards of months in some parts of Spain. It's happening. So it's really hard to get access to the free healthcare system. And then the private healthcare system is there. It's not as expensive, I would say. It's somehow subsidized, but it's available. But you have to kind of pay extra if you want that service. And so it can be very expensive to get healthcare in certain parts of the world. And in the United States, for example, the healthcare system is notoriously monetized. It's a privatized healthcare system. So it's a for-profit business. And you have to interact with this for-profit business. The same thing goes with food and the prices of food and how food is largely produced, at least in the United States, for example, by corporations rather than individuals. But overall, the whole thing is kind of monopolized in a way by, a couple of corporations, like Monsanto is a famous one. ConAgra is another one, the old Chicago stock exchange for grain and all of these things. There's a deep history of, the corporate nature of food in the Midwest due to the way those large tracts of land. So it favored the development of these corporations over time. And also, too, the education system. Getting an education in many parts of the world is exceedingly difficult, and it can be exceedingly expensive. To have the time and ability to acquire knowledge in the society is very hard, and it comes at a very, very high risk, a very financially high risk. For example, if you're a young person living in a poor city in the United States, your chances of going to a decent college are very low, just because of the price and the quality of the environment you grow up in. Not to mention that along the way, there's a ton of really dangerous traps to fall into, such as the for-profit college trap that, so many students ended up falling into. You have a lot of shady student loans out there, private student loans, adjustable rate student loans. So mind you, you're probably also going through this all at a very young age, so you are disadvantaged by not really having an understanding of how the system works, signing papers on your own, signing promissory notes to infinity, all these kinds of things. It's just a very vicious system that it's very, very difficult for many, many people to get through it. And it can be incredibly damaging as well in the long run if it doesn't work out right. So I'm going to take a bit of a break here, everyone. And when I get back, I'm going to keep going on with Diagnosing the Matrix. So I hope you enjoyed this part 1 of Diagnosing the Matrix. If you did, please comment, like, and subscribe. And thanks so much for listening.